But yeah, so I thought today we could discuss, because I've been seeing a lot of this on Twitter and on social media. We could discuss a little bit about colonialism and how we discuss colonialism in in popular culture, I guess, in everyday discourse, and how that is different from this kind of like this debate that is brewing in um, it's not popular discourse, but like discourse, like regular everyday discourse about whether colonialism is good or bad. And this is something that has been brewing a lot, not just in the UK. I mean, in Peru, we also have this same debate. A lot of Peruvians want to vindicate Spanish colonialism over Peru. There's a particular way of thinking in Peru that argues that Peru was not a colony, for example. Um, and that the Spanish Empire, the Spanish colonial empire, divided its colonial areas into so-called viceroyalties, and so there was a viceroy on top that answered directly to the king. And the traditional trope version of this in Peru is to say a viceroyalty is not a colony, and therefore there is no colonial dynamic, because it's like Scotland within the United Kingdom, right? So there was no colony in Peru. Peru was never a colony, and then it snowballs into, and we were better off as a colony than as an independent country. It is a discourse that is very pervasive. I've seen it in the UK as well. This general idea that there's this cultural war for the identity of the West, of how the West is seen in the West, and how it would be harmful if that pedigree, that idea of the West is best, is no longer prevalent in the way how British people see Britain, or in the way how Westerners see the West, or how Europeans see Europe, right? And I find that a very interesting conversation, um, because I was going through Twitter today, and I came across a tweet. Let me put it in the screen for you guys. Um, by a I mean a well relatively well-known historian. Hold on, let me put it in here. Um, so this is a tweet by Giles Udi, who's an academic. He writes about history, and he said this. Yesterday, I returned to the British Museum for the first time in a number of years. I reached a number of conclusions, primarily that British Museum appears to not only hate Britain and British history, but also, paradoxically, to really rather dislike the museum itself. The bookshop open shelves face everyone who passes through the central Great Court, and this is the message that they give the hundreds of British visitors and tourists who pass them every day. And so he puts all of these like books, this series of relatively like very well known books. And I guess my main question here is, why is it anti-British? It's interesting. Why is it anti-British to just say stuff like this? And one common trope, for example, that I see often is it is unfair to say that the empire was bad, because it engaged in the slave trade, because it also helped end the slave trade. And so you need to like balance it out. You need to like say, no, it wasn't as bad because it also ended the slave trade. And I keep thinking, um, how it doesn't. It's not a game to see what is good and what is bad. How much evil can be undone by how much supposed good. And consider that when the UK ended slavery, it was in part because of economic reasons, because it was no longer as profitable. Um, and at the end of the day, the people that were compensated for the end of slavery were not the slaves, were the slavers. And the slavers were compensated with such high amounts that the last payment to the enslavers' debt was paid in 2015. So we spent more than 200 years paying for that, compensation. Um, So it gets me thinking, why? Why is it that it is anti-British or anti-Peruvian or anti-Spanish to say that there is such a thing as a colonial past, and that you know, reading into it with any degree of like veracity, with any degree of honesty, is anti whatever that country comes from, as opposed to like just facts or historical facts, you know, or research into that. Why would it be anti? And also, why would it be the term advocate pops up a lot here? Activist, you know, not scholar, activist. So why is it activism? So where does this discourse come from? I find it particularly interesting. So 29 October 55 says so Vidi Lucy says, hi, I'm from Spain, and I would like to add that a lot of Spanish people also argue that Spanish colonialism in Latin America was not as bad, quote unquote, because compared to British imperialism, for example. I'm curious to know whether some people in Peru share that view. Well, Vidi Lucy, yes, a lot of people. So the way you need to understand Peru as a society is that it is divided in two, right? There's the urban, white, westernized elites and upper middle classes, and then the rest of the country, which is mestizo, indigenous descent, or indigenous or of color, right? And these two groups sort of like tend to disagree about things. They tend to have different priorities, right? It is my contention that the Andes and the Amazon and the people who live in those parts of the country are very much in a colonial relation with the people who live in Lima. Well, not the people who live in the elitist parts of Lima. And so in that little bubble that is white, mestizo, upper middle class to elite Lima, yes, that view that Spanish colonialism was not as bad and that it's all, a black legend promoted by the English so that they wouldn't look as bad, is very widespread. And there's this common trope within this discourse of imperial competition. My empire was not as bad as yours, or even was better than yours, right? It is an interesting dynamic where nationalism, patriotism, require you to not find any flaws in your own country, which is, something that I don't understand, because to me, to the degree that I can define myself as nationalist, and that's not a very big degree, but to the degree that I can define myself as a patriot, as a person who loves his own country, who really like wants the best for Peru, I can tell you I don't have that. I don't have that idea that, oh, everything that my country did needs to have been perfect, because otherwise I am being a traitor. On the contrary, I hold my own country to a ridiculously high standard, and I think that it did so many awful things in its history, and continues to do awful things. And I think it is my job as someone who loves his own country to, shed a light into it and say, this is wrong. You should not do this. And it might be a minoritarian position, but it is interesting how, we're supposed to look up from Peru. We're supposed to look up to Europe and think of it as the birthplace of these ideas about equality, about the rule of law, about I don't know, liberal ideas about development and the role of the citizen. But then this is the place where empire is defended, and empire is like very much not liberal. Right? Even though it is defended in liberal terms. And this is an interesting internal contradiction in the discourse. Empire is defended in liberal terms, but it isn't applied liberally wherever it is deployed. Right? So there is an argument of saying we need to salvage the idea of the West. The idea of the West is superior. The idea of the West is important, because it has these like fundamental aspects that no other culture developed. say the rule of law, equality before the law, limited government, all of these liberal principles that supposedly exist in every country. Just don't tell them about Trump, right? Don't tell them about Farage. And how, because of this like innate ideas that the West developed, and the West as an ideology, the West as a way of living, has to be superior to other ways of living, and therefore it needs to be preserved. So it needs to be regarded with extra credit. Is you did better than the rest, so therefore we cannot criticize it, because if we criticize the West, all of a sudden the entire architecture of development, of the advancement of human culture collapses. Because if the West collapses, then all of a sudden we start being invaded by these other cultures that are less advanced, right? And so this history that seeks to criticize discourses on colonialism and criticism of colonialism ends up becoming not so much about history, but about a political project to uphold those Western values as the non plus ultra, as the best thing that humanity has to offer, as the most advanced level of human knowledge. Which is interesting because there's a lot of like internal critique currently now in like contemporary times about those liberal principles coming from the West. So it is not just upholding the West as an idea, it is upholding a specific period of the West in high regard. Like when this project talks about colonialism as and critique of colonialism as bad because it endangers the idea of the West, they're not thinking about civil rights in the 1960s. They're not thinking about, I don't know, the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. They're not thinking about the end of apartheid in South Africa. They are thinking about 19th, 18th, 17th century thinkers that came up with core ideas, like the social contract, for example, that are now being criticized from within the West. Like if you take a class on the social contract today and your college lecturer says, "Oh, it's an awesome theory, it has no downside," then you're probably not getting the full story of what scholarship says about the social contract right now, because now we can understand that that social contract was very excluding in its formulation. Like all men are created equal did not mean all men, but it did mean no women, right? So there is a racial contract that comes attached to the social contract, Charles Mills, right? And there is a gender contract as well. So there is a level of critique of social contract theories that comes from within the West today. And yet that's not the version of the West that they want to uphold as a political project. What they want to uphold is this like older idea, like the good old times, like make the West great again. And the eternal question comes up is, when was the West great? When there was slavery, when there was segregation, when there was what? When was it so great as a role model? And I guess that is the big problem. The big problem from where we start is that this language of, oh well, but like they hate Britain and therefore it's bad history. How does good history look like? I saw Alan Lester, who's just another historian, complain about this, quote tweeting this tweet saying, "How does good history look like? Is patriotic history better than critical history? Is pro-British history better? Is nationalist history better? Or is it just biased? And why should we not account for that bias?" Right? So just as a political project, just the very notion of saying we need to defend the West as a political project is itself suspect for the production of good academic research. Right? Because you already know the ending of your research. Your research needs to say that the West is best. And so your research will probably reflect that, no matter what you find in your findings. In fact, many of these conversations, many of these, if you go on YouTube, you will see a bunch of videos about the case for colonialism, or why colonialism receives a bad name unfairly. And I'm thinking about Bruce Gilley, who wrote this article that was withdrawn from a public, I think it was the Third World Quarterly, for writing an article entitled "The Case for Colonialism," right? Or I don't know. Who else? Nigel Biggar, for example, who's an ethicist at Oxford, who wrote the Colonialism: A Moral Reckoning. All of these works of art, works of like scholarship that start from the perspective of let's protect the legacy of the West as a political project, sort of follow a similar pattern. They first go into a very nuanced, very not nuanced, um very direct contestation of some big accusations of empire. So, for example, Nigel Biggar does there was no genocide of Tasmanians. That's a lie, because I have the data here that says that really it wasn't, or there was no genocide of the Herero, and you are being unfair because if you look at the sources, and they question, they try to question the credentials of histories of colonialism. And then they go on to say, and actually, it's not only that your claims are a lie; it's also that the project was good. There are advantages to colonialism. And I have a video. We can look at it later. And I find it interesting because this idea of, how can I put this? The West as a civilizer, the West as this idea that can lead you to a better world. This is the empire is justifiable because it is this idea that grabbed these Western values and expanded them all throughout the world so that other peoples that were quote unquote less advanced could civilize themselves. The civilizatory mission, the civilizing mission of colonialism. And that is good because then you can understand that it was a selfless act. And so no matter how terrible, no other people, no other group of people, only the Westerners tried to elevate others and try to make them better. That is the logic, right? But when you look at the discourses surrounding colonialism, this idea that the object was to elevate the savage was really never there. When you look at it from the perspective of, when you look at the documents, it was almost never there. So Adara says, I did a year abroad in Barcelona, and it was crazy to me how the Spanish people still saw people from South America as backward and lesser than them. I mean, there is a growing trend in Spain to embrace this kind of line of thinking, but it is also present in Peru. So it's not just in Spain. There is a lot of Peruvians that, well, not a lot. There's a significant group of Peruvians that embrace, the cross of Burgundy and in Peru we say Hispanismo. So I don't know Hispanism. I don't know how to translate it. And they do see indigeneity as backward. So Peruvian indigeneity is backward. Peruvian Hispanic nature is advanced. So Osvin says, every time I see Hispanistas fly the Burgundy cross in Lima, of all places, I cringe on primal level. Yeah, and right now in Peru, there's a big debate going on because the statue of Francisco Pizarro, the conquistador that I guess conquered the Incan Empire, Tawantinsuyo. I hate the term Incan Empire because it wasn't an empire. Empire is a Western term that has been applied on the Incan Empire. The Incas referred to themselves as the Tawantinsuyo, which is like the union of the four regions, areas, whatever. But yeah, so the statue of Francisco Pizarro is being, it used to be in the center of the Lima main square, and then it was moved because we didn't want Francisco Pizarro there, and now it's being moved back because we elected a fascist for a mayor. So, um, so this is a big debate in Peru right now, whether the statue of the Spanish conquistador should be in the main square of Lima. So Conservativerk, hey, it's your first time chatting, so welcome to the community, says, and then many of the peoples they plundered them from also plundered them from other people, as it turns out. I mean, this is a common argument. There's this common argument about colonialism that is, everybody was insert bad characteristic, right? Everybody was racist. Every single empire in the history of the world, or every single people in the history of the world, every human society was racist or enslaved people, or I don't know, stole, looted cultural property from others, etc., etc. Right? And I've never been very convinced by that argument. I've never been very convinced because if, first of all, every society was racist. Let's start with that one. I would say, yeah, every society has had a specific kind of like argument at some point about how the way they do things are better. That's true. To conceptualize that superiority idea in the framework of racism, though, they would need to first invent the concept of race, which is not something that every society developed. Granted, every society had an idea of what we do is better, like let's say centrism, whatever centrism, Sinocentrism, Japan centrism, or Inca centrism. That's true, but discovering the idea of race is a next step. Not everyone did that. Of the ones that did that, not everyone wrote entire books about how the size of skulls mattered for determining whether someone was, superior or inferior, which the West did. I don't know if they were the only ones to do it, but certainly one of them to do it. And so this entire notion of race was then tied up to the idea of human progress, right? The more that you look and act like us, the more civilized you are. I don't think that is everyone. Every human society has written books about how if you look a certain way, you are inherently inferior. I don't think so. But let's assume for sake of argument that, yes, every single society in the history of humanity has actually rationalized a concept of race and then determined that people that were on that scale of different races were inferior because of that race, because of their like physical attributes or because of whatever attribute, right? In that version of the argument, we're assuming that is the case. So what? Okay, then in that case, we get to criticize all of them. Why is it wrong then to criticize the West? And then you might tell me, oh, because it's you're only criticizing the West. And I would respond, well, one, that's not true. There's a lot written about, for example, the slave trade in the Indian Ocean, for example, the Arab slave trade, for example. There's a lot written about that, and yet it doesn't produce the same reaction. And second, well, yes, it sort of makes sense that Western academia, the most dominant academia in the world, would focus on the West. It sort of makes sense. So it comes with the territory of being the center for producing, for producing knowledge, right? So I've never been very convinced by that argument. So everyone plundered, everyone was racist, everyone enslaved. Okay, I don't see how that disproves anything. Oh, hey HMC, how are you? I just saw that you commented. So HMC says Western society is functional in a way that global South societies are not. I think you may be putting the cart in front of the ox in this one, HMC, because global South societies are not functional because of Western engagement, right? The control that you would need is a society that was completely free of Western interventionism, for you to say, oh yeah, of course, global South societies are inferior. But you don't have that because there is no single nation on the face of this earth that wasn't affected by Western imperialism. Not even Ethiopia was free from Western imperialism. It was never colonized, but it was very much intervened by Western powers to the point where even fascist Italy invaded it. Right. So there is no nation in this earth in the global South that was free from Western imperialism. Not even China, with all its power, was free from Western imperialism. Not even Japan. So, which were like the more powerful nations in the non-Western world. So you don't actually have a sample to make that assessment. So HMC says, if colonialism was about exterminating other groups or exploiting them, how do you explain the fact that the average life expectancy of colonized areas, most notably Africa, steadily increased under colonialism? Shouldn't it have been decreasing? I don't know why that is proof of anything, really. I'm not claiming that colonialism is about exterminating anyone. On the contrary, colonialism has several different facets. You can have, settler colonialism, where you actually do go in and genocide the indigenous population, like in the United States. I don't think you can tell me that the population of indigenous people in the Americas increased between 1492 and 1550 or 1650. I don't think you can tell me that. But there's also exploitation capitalism, where it is to your interest to keep the local population alive. Arguably, you're trying to quote unquote civilize them. So yeah, population would probably go up. Because that's your forced labor. So you want to have more of that. So I don't understand that. I don't think that's reasonable. Iconoclast says, I personally think that it started with the idea of civilization, and it continues also because of economic reasons. Resources and routes were multiple, and it allowed the development of Western countries and participated in the industrialization of the West. Yeah, I mean, there's a the reason why these ideas about the West is better emerge is because there's a it's sort of like it is convenient to Spain and to the UK and England to expand to other parts of the world because there's resources there. So there is an economic aspect to colonialism. Again, this idea that the West civilized the world sort of flies in the face of the way in which it was done. Again, all of these liberal values about equality, about like how there's rule of law, sort of go out the window. All you need to do is like start digging a little bit, and you'll see that in different empires, there was always people that said, "Whoa, dude, you're killing a lot of people here." In the Spanish case, you have Bartolomé de las Casas. In the UK, you have Edmund Burke. Every empire has someone that says, "Whoa, man, what are we doing? This isn't how we're supposed to be doing this. We're supposed to be helping our subjects, not committing all of these injustices." And yet they keep on happening. It doesn't matter how much you say, "Oh, but actually we all have signed a social contract and we are all equal because all men are created equal." No, you still have slaves, you still have second-class citizens, and colonized peoples, and so that's how it basically develops. So you end up with this very lofty justification of civilization, but you never actually carry it out because you already started off from the no, we need to be on top, we need the resources that are here, we need to exploit the people that are here. If the end goal, if there is actual equality between the Western and the non-Western, the colonized and the colonizer, then colonialism doesn't work, right? So it is a lofty mission that can never be accomplished because then it would rid colonialism of its purpose. Jartov says the imperial core is also becoming despotic with liberal makeup. I love the imperial boomerang. Yeah, I mean that is what I was discussing previously, right? One thing that tends to happen here is that for decades, scholars, there's an entire book about this. Let me put it in the. So in this book, Capitalism as Civilization, the argument that was made in this book, which is fairly recent, like it's from 2020. In this book, the argument is the language of civilization, the language of empire, the language of there's a scale of people, some more developed than others, some with a higher culture than others, never really went away. It's still there, hiding behind the language of development, behind the language of, conservation, behind the language of international law, behind this idea that you can bomb certain parts of the world but not others, behind the idea that if you don't subscribe to the war on terror, we'll bomb you. If you don't subscribe to the liberal consensus, we will not give you a loan. All of these like structures that exist in the world today are also colonial in nature. And they resonate with the standard of civilization, with the idea that different cultures are in a hierarchy. And the really innovative claim of the really interesting claim of the book was these dynamics, these unfair dynamics that we see in the world, are the same as we had in the 1900s with a different dressing, with a different costume. What is happening now is that language is being stripped away. That camouflage, that makeup on top of the language of civilization is now being stripped away, and people are saying, no, you know what, there is such a thing as a less advanced culture, as an inferior culture. The West is better. Still, today, to this day. And therefore, it is, you should accept our leadership, our ruling. There are people today that are saying that it would be good for, say, Haiti to be recolonized. Because only the Westerners can help Haiti, when to a large degree, it was France that led Haiti to where it is right now, and the United States. The United States with its invasion of Haiti in the early 20th century, and France with its imposing huge debt on Haiti upon independence because poor slavers had lost their slaves. So we had a period of like 50 years where we were moving away from this language of civilization and trying to dress it up in other things, because it's not really nice to talk about civilized and uncivilized. And now we have like this big movement all around the West that says, no, actually we are more civilized, we are superior. And so we're going back in a boomerang, and that will have consequences beyond the relationship between the global South and the West, because there will be dynamics inside Western countries that are no longer these like isolated white populations. Now they are diverse populations inside of the countries where you will have the kind of race riots that the UK had not that long ago. Okay, so I think my main argument here is that, one, this is not about history. I don't think it's about history. I don't think this is about good or bad history. I think this is about the value for a Western society of having people, being nationalistic. Some British people want the British people to be nationalistically British. Some people in Spain want Spanish people to be nationalistic about Spain, which I will distinguish from general love of country. They want their own countries to never have done any wrong. They need to be forces of good in the world. That is the political objective. And in that political objective, the result of history that says we actually did some good, is good history. The history that criticizes is bad history. That is not history. That is presentism. You already have your objective decided, and you are, making it happen. But then, even when you want to argue, well, the reason why the West is superior, the West is better, is because it was trying to civilize inferior cultures. There's several hurdles that you need to go through. Like, number one, what made those cultures inferior? By what metric? And two, even when this argument of let's civilize the uncivilized was uttered, it was never fulfilled, because it was premised on an idea that these people are inferior. Their culture is inferior, they are inferior, and so you have to civilize the uncivilizable. So eventually, most empires ended up saying they are uncivilizable, therefore we will just do some liberal despotism. We will just dominate them because we are better. This is the argument in this book here. Hold on, let me put it on the screen. Alibis of Empire. European empires went from justifications of empire on ethical grounds to alibis of empire, saying, oh, we are already here and we are superior, therefore we can impose our own way of doing things. And that made the kinds of atrocities that we've seen throughout the history of empire, in all empires. I don't really care which empire was better and which empire was worse. I think they were all bad in different degrees. And for the simple reason that they are denying people self-determination. If the true mission of empire was let's help out, then it wouldn't have been a military and commercial venture to dominate specific parts of the world and subject their populations to different standards of living, different second-class citizenry. Right? If it were really a selfless act to help, it would not have looked like empire. It would have looked like something else. Right? So that promise of we will civilize you never came true, because it always was overshadowed by the idea of, but actually your culture or you are inferior. For whatever reason, you are inferior. And so you are always uncivilizable. And then therefore that ends up in massacres, that ends up in oppression. And that's why empires ended. That's why there are long histories of resistance to empire in every single colonial empire. There's been people that have rebelled against that empire. So it's typical in this idea of like, oh, but the British Empire ended slavery. Yeah, I mean, a couple hundred years after the first slave revolt. So there were people way before the British that were already saying slavery is bad and being oppressed by the British, trying to keep slavery on the books. So this idea that, oh, but we are the first people to end slavery. Sure, the first European empire to ban slavery in their empire. Yes. Not the first group of people within the British Empire to say slavery is bad, we should end it. Those were the slaves that were saying that, trying to revolt from very early on in the British Empire. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like content like this and you would like to see more, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You can also come to one of my live streams or join my Discord server. It's really great that you're here, because we're really trying to grow this community and turn it into a space where we can all come together to discuss about international law and international relations. So really thank you for your support. Until next time.